The storm hit the city like a sledgehammer. Rain poured down in thick sheets, turning every street into a river and every sidewalk into a mirror. The sound of water hitting concrete mixed with the sharp click of footsteps echoing off empty buildings. Neon signs buzzed and flickered overhead, casting weird colors across the wet pavement. Red, blue, green. All the colors bled together in the puddles like spilled paint. The air tasted like metal and wet stone. It was the smell of a city that had seen better days, a place where dreams came to die. Drake Martinez pulled his old coat tighter around his shoulders. The sleeves were getting thin at the edges, and he could feel the cold creeping through the worn fabric. His fingers were already going numb. Walking home from the lab was something he could do with his eyes closed. After 3 years of taking the same route, his feet knew every crack in the sidewalk, every broken streetlight, every corner where trouble might be waiting. He always chose the back roads, the narrow alleys where fewer people wandered, the quieter paths where he could think without being bothered. Drake liked being alone. In fact, he preferred it that way. People were complicated. They asked too many questions, wanted too much from him. The silence was easier to handle, but tonight felt different. The city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As he turned the corner onto Maple Street, Drake's steps slowed. There was a sound cutting through the rain, something that didn't belong. It wasn't the usual noise of the city. No car horns, no shouting, no sirens wailing in the distance. This sound was soft and broken, like someone crying. But it was more than that. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest feel tight. The melody rose and fell with the rhythm of the storm, but it didn't sound human. It was too pure, too raw, like grief turned into music. Drake stopped walking. His heart started beating faster. Every smart part of his brain told him to keep going, to mind his own business, to get home before the storm got worse. The streets weren't safe at night. Thieves and worse things prowled these alleys, looking for easy targets. But something about that sound pulled at him. It was like a rope tied around his ribs, tugging him toward the darkness. Against every rule he'd made for himself, Drake followed. The voice. The alley was narrow and stunk like garbage and old rain. Water pooled in the broken pavement, creating little lakes that reflected the dim light from a flickering street lamp. Drake's shoes splashed through the puddles as he moved deeper into the shadows. His breath came out in small white puffs, mixing with the cold air. That's when he saw her. A woman sat hunched against the brick wall, her arms wrapped around her knees like she was trying to hold herself together. But she wasn't just any woman. Her skin glowed with a deep purple light, like the color of twilight just before night falls. The light seemed to come from inside her, pulsing gently with each breath she took. Rain streaked down her face, mixing with tears that caught the light from the street lamp. When she looked up and saw him, Drake felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Her eyes were huge and bright, filled with a sadness so deep it seemed to go on forever. She was starving. Drake could see it in the way her hands shook, in the hollow look of her cheeks, in the way she held her stomach like it hurt. Her lips moved, and another sound came out, that same beautiful, broken melody he'd heard from the street. But now he could hear the desperation in it, the plea for help. Drake's mind went blank. She wasn't human. The purple glow of her skin, the strange patterns of light that traced up and down her arms like living tattoos, the otherworldly sound of her voice. Everything about her screamed alien. Fear hit him like a cold wave. He had no idea what she was, where she'd come from, or what kind of danger she might bring. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think of anything except running away as fast as he could. But then she tried to stand up. Her legs shook like a newborn colt's, and she fell back against the wall with a soft thud. Her head dropped forward, and Drake could see that even that small effort had drained what little strength she had left. She was dying. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Drake moved before his brain could catch up. He stepped into the rain-soaked alley, his shoes squelching in the mud and water. "Hey," he said, his voice steady even though his heart was racing like a jackrabbit. "Can you hear me?" She lifted her head again, and their eyes met. Drake had never seen anything like her before. Her features were similar to human ones, but different in ways that made his eyes water if he looked too long. Her face was longer, more angular, and her skin seemed to shimmer and move in the dim light. But the pain in her eyes was something he recognized. It was the same look he'd seen in the mirror too many times. She reached out with one trembling hand, and Drake felt his chest tighten. He hesitated for just a heartbeat, one moment of doubt, 1 second of fear, before kneeling down beside her. In the dirty water. "I'll help you," he said, his voice softer now, gentler. He wasn't sure if she could understand his words, but maybe she could understand his tone. "You're going to be okay." Her hand moved closer, brushing against the sleeve of his coat. Her skin was cool and smooth, almost like glass, but he could feel how fragile she was beneath his touch. She felt like she might break if he held her too tight. Her lips moved again, and this time Drake could tell she was trying to speak. But the sounds that came out were nothing like any language he'd ever heard. They were musical, like a song made of hums and clicks and soft whistles. It was beautiful, but it made him feel helpless. Drake shook his head. "I don't understand," he admitted, wishing he could do more. "But you need help, don't you?" She nodded, a small, hesitant movement that made his chest feel even tighter. There was no mistaking her desperation now. She was asking for help, and he was the only one who could give it. Without another word, Drake pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shaking shoulders. She went stiff at first, like she was afraid he might hurt her. But then she relaxed and her body seemed to fold into the warmth of the fabric. "Come on," he said, standing up and offering his hand. "Let's get you out of this rain." Her eyes flicked from his outstretched hand to his face and back again. Drake could see her trying to decide whether to trust him. After a long moment, she placed her delicate fingers in his palm. Her grip was weak, but there was something in the way she held his hand that told him she was choosing to trust him. He pulled her to her feet, keeping one arm around her waist to steady her as she swayed. Her legs were long and thin, but they didn't seem built for walking on rough ground. Each step she took was careful and uncertain, like she was learning how to walk all over again as they emerged from the alley. The rain hit them with renewed force. Drake wrapped his arm around her shoulders to keep her steady, and she flinched at the contact but didn't pull away. A few people hurried past them on the sidewalk, their faces hidden under umbrellas and hoods. Drake caught some of them staring, heard whispered comments and saw sideways glances. He ignored them all. He didn't owe anybody an explanation. His apartment building was only a few blocks away, but it felt like miles. The building was old and worn, a leftover from when the city had been prosperous and full of hope. Now it was just another place where people tried to forget about their problems. The elevator groaned and shuddered as it carried them up to the 3rd floor. The light inside flickered on and off, casting weird shadows on the walls. Drake noticed that the patterns on her arms were glowing brighter now, pulsing in rhythm with her shallow breathing. They looked like living art, like someone had painted lightning under her skin. She caught him staring and shifted uncomfortably, pulling his coat tighter around herself. "You're safe now," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. The elevator door slid open with a rusty screech, and Drake guided her down the narrow hallway to his apartment. Inside, the space was simple but clean. White walls, a worn couch that had seen better days, and a cluttered desk covered with papers and half-finished projects from work. It wasn't much, but it was home. He helped her to the couch, where she sank into the cushions with a soft sigh. Drake grabbed a blanket from the closet and draped it over her shoulders. Her large eyes followed him as he moved around the room, watching him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. She pressed a hand to her stomach and winced as she shifted position. The movement was small, but Drake saw it. He crouched beside her, his brow creasing with worry. "Are you hurt?" he asked, gesturing to her abdomen. "Is it your stomach?" She nodded faintly, her lips trembling as she tried to speak again. Her words were still incomprehensible, but her distress was clear as day. Drake's mind raced. Was she injured? Sick? Starving? He thought back to the lab, to the medical supplies he kept on hand for his experiments. "Stay here," he said, rising from his crouch. "I'll be right back." He rummaged through a drawer in his desk, finding a small scanner, a device designed to detect basic vital signs. It wasn't meant for humans, much less aliens, but it was better than nothing. When he returned, she tensed up, her eyes narrowing at the unfamiliar device. "It's okay," Drake said, holding up his hands in a calming gesture. "It won't hurt you. I promise." He knelt beside her again, showing her the scanner before pressing it gently to her wrist. The device hummed and beeped, its small screen flashing as it tried to make sense of her readings. The results were garbled, a mix of symbols and numbers he didn't recognize. But one thing was clear. Her energy levels were dangerously low. If she didn't eat soon, her condition would get worse. Much worse. Drake sighed and set the scanner aside. "You need food," he said, gesturing toward his kitchen. "I'll make you something. Just stay here and rest." As he moved to the kitchen, he couldn't help but glance back at her. She sat motionless on the couch, her alien features softened by exhaustion, and what looked like trust. Drake didn't understand why she was here, or how she'd ended up in such a desperate state. But one thing was certain. He couldn't turn his back on her. For the first time in years, his empty apartment felt like it had a purpose. Drake moved with determination, opening cabinets and checking his limited supply of food. He wasn't much of a cook. He usually lived on instant meals and coffee, working late into the night, instead of bothering with elaborate dinners. Tonight was different. Tonight, someone needed him. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, its soft rhythm creating a peaceful background to the quiet hum of his apartment. From the corner of his eye, Drake could see the woman stirring on the couch. She was still wrapped in his blanket, but her purple skin was glowing a little brighter now. The intricate patterns along her arms pulsed softly, like a heartbeat made of light. She watched him with intense curiosity, her luminous eyes moving between his hands and the strange objects around the room. Everything must seem foreign to her, Drake realized. The appliances, the furniture, even the way he moved. It was all alien to her, just as she was alien to him. "You're safe," he said again, more to fill the silence than because he expected her to understand. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharpening as though she were trying to decode his words. The quiet attention made him nervous. Drake was used to being the one who observed, not the one being studied. He decided to keep things simple. An egg and vegetable stir-fry wasn't fancy, but it was warm and filling. As he chopped onions, their sharp scent filled the air. The woman flinched and wrinkled her nose, a surprisingly human reaction that made him chuckle. "Not a fan of onions?" he asked, setting down the knife. Her gaze lingered on the cutting board, then shifted to the pan heating on the stove. She made a soft sound, somewhere between curiosity and confusion, her expression one of cautious interest. Drake held up an egg, turning it so she could see it clearly. "Food," he said slowly, making sure to speak each syllable clearly. He tapped it gently against the counter, showing her the crack that formed before letting the contents fall into the hot pan. Her eyes widened at the sight, as if he'd just performed magic. She leaned forward, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, and pointed at the egg, then at him. There was a questioning look on her face, like she was trying to understand what had just happened. "Egg," he repeated, gesturing to the pan. "You eat it." He mimed eating, hoping the gesture would translate across species barriers. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Her expression softened, and for the first time since he'd found her, she looked almost hopeful. It was the first sign that communication between them might be possible, however limited. As the vegetables sizzled and the aroma of cooking filled the room, she stood up from the couch. Her movement was unsteady but determined. Drake paused, unsure whether to help her or let her explore on her own. She took a tentative step toward the kitchen, her bare feet silent against the floor. Her movements were graceful but definitely not human. Each step was deliberate and careful, as if she were testing the ground for stability. She pointed at the pan, her large eyes questioning everything she saw. Drake made a decision. He handed her the spatula, a bold move, he realized, since he had no idea how she might react to unfamiliar objects. She grasped it awkwardly, holding it like it might be a weapon. He couldn't help but laugh, despite everything. Gently he corrected her grip, guiding her hand to show her how to stir the vegetables. "You do it like this," he said, demonstrating the motion. "See? Just move it around." She followed his lead, her movements hesitant but precise. The spatula clattered against the pan once, and she flinched, glancing at him with worry in her eyes. "You're doing fine," he said, offering her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about it." The simple act of teaching her, of bridging their impossibly different worlds through something as basic as cooking, felt surreal. Her focus on the task was intense, as though mastering this skill was a matter of survival. And maybe, for her, it was. When the meal was ready, Drake spooned it onto 2 plates and placed them on the small table by the couch. He gestured for her to sit, and she complied, her movements still cautious but more relaxed than before. He picked up a fork and demonstrated eating, taking a bite, and then gesturing for her to do the same. She mimicked him, lifting the food to her lips with visible uncertainty. Her first taste was tentative, barely touching the fork to her tongue. But then her eyes widened, and the faintest hint of a smile crossed her face. She made a soft melodic sound that could only be described as approval. Drake couldn't help but grin. "You like it?" he said, not really asking. She nodded eagerly, taking another bite with more confidence. Watching her eat with such obvious relief and gratitude stirred something deep in his chest. He'd brought her out of that dark, rain-soaked alley, but now he wondered if maybe he'd pulled himself out of something just as bleak. As she finished the meal, Drake sat back and observed her more closely. The glow of her skin had definitely brightened, and the patterns along her arms were more defined now. Whatever she was, wherever she came from, her body was responding well to the food and warmth. "I don't know how you got here," he said softly, not expecting an answer but needing to voice his thoughts. "But you're not from around here, are you?" He gestured toward the window, where the city skyline was barely visible through the rain-streaked glass. "You're from out there, somewhere far away." Her eyes followed his gesture, and for a moment, Something like deep sorrow clouded her expression. She placed a hand over her heart and closed her eyes. The glowing patterns on her arms dimmed until they were barely visible. Then she opened her eyes and looked directly at him. With her hands, she mimed an explosion, her fingers spreading wide, then contracting. After that, she made a sharp downward motion, like something falling from a great height. Drake's stomach dropped. A crash, he said, the pieces clicking together in his mind. You crashed here. She nodded, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that made his breath catch. There was understanding between them now, a shared acknowledgement of her loss. Whatever ship or home she'd come from was gone, destroyed, leaving her stranded in a world that didn't know she existed. He hesitated, then leaned forward. The next question felt heavy, loaded with implications he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Ah, you alone? The question hung in the air between them like a physical thing. She blinked, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Then she shook her head, a small gesture, but unmistakable. Someone or something was looking for her. The realization hit Drake like a physical blow. If she wasn't alone, then whoever was searching for her might already be on Earth. They might be close. They might be dangerous. He glanced at the window, at the dark city beyond, and wondered what else might be out there in the rain-soaked streets. What other secrets was the night hiding? And what had he gotten himself into by bringing her home? But as he looked back at her, at this strange, beautiful creature who had somehow wandered into his life, Drake realized he didn't care about the danger. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The night had changed everything, and there was no going back. Window again, his thoughts racing. What had he gotten himself into? As the night deepened, the woman settled back onto their couch, her breathing steady, but her posture tense. Drake stood in the kitchen, his mind a whirlwind of questions and uncertainties. Yet one thing remained clear: he couldn't abandon her. Not now. She brought a storm of mystery into his quiet life, but he wasn't the type to leave someone to face it alone for the first time in years. His life had veered off its carefully plotted course, and despite the risks, he couldn't help but feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Drake awoke to the sound of soft rustling for a moment. Helay, still the memory of the previous day hovering at the edges of his awareness then. It struck him: Raver, the alien woman, luminous and otherworldly, who had turned his solitary life inside out, was now his uninvited but undeniable guest. He sat up abruptly, scanning the room. The couch where she had slept was empty, the blanket crumpled. In a loose heat, panic shot through him. Had she left, or worse, had someone come for her? Raver, he Khaled's voice sharpened the stillness. The sound of movement came from the kitchen. He moved quickly, rounding the corner to find her standing by the counter. Relief washed over him, though it was tinged with curiosity. She was utterly transfixed by a metal spoon, holding it up to the light, as though it were a relic of profound significance. Her violet skin glimmered faintly, and the glowing patterns along her arms seemed brighter, more defined after a night of rest. "Good morning," he said, his tone cautious but friendly. She turned to face him, her eyes luminous and alert for a moment. She just stared, as if assessing him, then gestured toward the spoon and tilted her head. Drake chuckled despite himself. "It's a spoon, you use it to eat." He minded, scooping food and bringing it to his mouth. She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the smooth metal. Then she pointed to a glass on the counter and looked at him. Expectantly, he picked it up and filled it with water, handing it to her. She sniffed the liquid before taking a cautious sip. Her expression shifted: mild surprise, followed by approval. She nodded again, setting the glass down. "Guess you like that," Drake said, smiling. "Baby steps." Right. Raver's gaze didn't waver from him and gestured toward the table. She sat first, motioning for him to join her. He hesitated, then pulled out a chair. She pressed her palms flat against the surface, her glowing patterns pulsating faintly. and then touched her forehead with one hand. Slowly she extended that hand toward him. Drake stared at her outstretched hand, the faint shimmer off her skin almost hypnotic. "What are you trying to say?" he murmured. She repeated the gesture, her expression insistent but calm against his better judgment. He placed his hand on hers. A jolt of energy surged through him, not painful but startlingly vivid. The room around him blurred and twisted as his mind filled with alien images and sensations. He saw a vast starship, its sleek silver hull reflecting a galaxy of stars inside corridors, pulsed with soft light, the same glow that now emanate from Reva's skin. Her people moved through feels with purpose, their expressions calm, yet focused. He felt their collective connection, as though they shared thoughts and emotions effortlessly. Then chaos. The ship shuddered violently, as an explosion tore through its hull, sending debris spinning into the void. Alarms blared, but the sound felt distant compared to the overwhelming sensation of fear. Reva was running, her breath labored, her surroundings bathed in the red glow of emergency lights. She reached a small pod, throwing herself inside just as the ship erupted in a blinding flash of light. The last image lingered, a view of the ship broken and lifeless, as her pod hurtled away into the darkness. Drake gasped, pulling his hand back as the vision faded. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind struggled to process what he had seen. Reva watched him closely, her expression somber, her hands now resting in her lap. "Your ship," he said, his voice low. "It was attacked." She nodded, her luminous eyes filled with sorrow. She touched her chest, then pointed to him, and minded an explosion. Her fingers spling outward. "They're looking for you," Drake said, piecing it together. "Whoever destroyed your ship, they're coming." Reva nodded again, her posture tense. She placed both hands on the table and leaned forward slightly, her glowing patterns dimming as if reflecting her unease. Drake stood pacing the small kitchen. "Why?" he asked aloud, though hadn't expect an answer. "What do they want with you?" She touched her chest again, this time pressing her palm flat against it, and then minded giving something away. Drake frowned. "You have something they want, information technology." Reva shook her head, then touched her arm, where the glowing patterns pulsed faintly. She held her arm out toward him, her expression expectant. "It's you," Drake realized. "Whatever's in you or about you, it's what they're after." Her shoulders sagged slightly, as though acknowledging the weight of the truth. Drake's mind raced. If they were coming for her, then staying in one place was dangerous. But where could they go? The city wasn't exactly a sanctuary, and he doubted they'd blend in anywhere else. As the hours passed, Reva continued her language lessons, quickly picking up words and gestures that helped bridge the gap between them. She mimicked Drake's words with a melodic accent that made even mundane terms sound like part of a song. Her intelligence, so starkly different from human norms, was unmistakable. When she pointed at him and said his name, Drake, for the first time, he couldn't help but smile. Her voice carried a warmth that contrasted with the cold fear of their situation. "What about you?" he asked. "What do I call you?" She touched her chest. "Reva," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Reva," he repeated, testing the unfamiliar name. "It suits you." Her glow brightened slightly, and she nodded as if pleased. As night fell, the city's usual cacophony of noise faded into an uneasy silence. Found himself checking the window more often than he wanted to admit. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Movement, shadows, signs of the danger. Reva had fled. The weight of her pursuers loomed over him, unseen but oppressive. Reva stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the street below. Her patterns flickered erratically, a sign of distress that Drake had come to recognize. He joined her, peering into the darkness. "What is it?" he asked. She pointed to a figure standing at the edge of the street. Cloaked in shadows, it remained motionless, its presence unnerving. Drake's stomach tightened. "They found you," he murmured. Reva grabbed his arm, her grip firm despite her slender frame. She gestured toward the door, her movements frantic, as though urging him to flee. "No," he said firmly, "running won't solve this. We need a plan." Her glowing patterns dimmed, but but she nodded, trusting his resolve. Drake glanced back at the window where the figure had vanished into the shadows. The danger was real, and it was closer than ever. But as he turned to Raver, her luminous eyes filled with determination. He felt a flicker of hope. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Drake pressed his back against door, his breath still uneven from the confrontation. The splintered wood creaked under his weight, a reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Raver stood near the window, her body bathed in the dim flickering light of her pattern's glow, usually steady and rhythmic, now pulsed erratically, betraying her fear. She stared at the street below, scanning for movement. Her luminous eyes wide and unblinking. He exhaled, slowly steadying himself. "We can't stay here," he said, breaking the silence. His voice carried more certainty than he felt. Raver turned to face him, her head tilting slightly, the universal gesture for a question. "They'll come back," he explained, motioning toward the door, "and next time they won't be alone." Raver nodded, her movements deliberate and graceful, but her expression remained tense. She walked to the table where the remains of their earlier conversation, papers scattered, drawings, and hastily scribbled words still lay. Picking up the pen, she began to sketch. Drake watched as her delicate fingers moved quickly, drawing a jagged outline of mountains surrounded by swirling shapes. She pointed to the peaks, then to herself, and finally to him. "Yowant to go there," Drake said, trying to follow her logic. "The mountains you think it's safe." She nodded, her glowing patterns briefly flaring as if to emphasize her agreement. Her hand moved to her chest, tracing the glowing lines with her fingertips before pointing again to the mountains. Drake frowned, leaning closer. "Wait, are you saying the mountains will protect you? Or is it there's something connected to you, Raver?" Raver hesitated, then drew a small circle at the base of one peak surrounded by jagged lines that resembled energy. She tapped the circle twice, her eyes meeting his. "Something's there," he said, piecing it together. "Something you need." He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the room. "All right, then that's where we go." Moved quickly, grabbing a backpack and stuffing it with essentials: food, water, a flashlight, and the heavy wrench that had proven useful in the fight. He handed Raver one of his spare jackets, and although it hung loosely on her slender frame, she wrapped it tightly around herself without complaint. As he packed, his thoughts churned. Whoever or whatever the cloaked figure was, it wasn't working alone. The precision of its movements, the weapon it had wielded, all pointed to something far beyond an ordinary pursuer. Reversaticas were organized, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted: the memory of her earlier vision reservist in his mind, the glowing sphere, the frantic escape, and the devastation that had followed whatever part of that sphere she carried. It was powerful enough to destroy her ship, and now it had put a target on both of their backs. Raver stood by the window again, her patterns dimming slightly as she gazed outside. The streetlights cast long distorted shadows across the empty pavement, and the distant hum of the city felt ominously quiet, joined her peering out into the darkness. "Do you think they're still out there?" he asked. Raver nodded once, then tapped her chest and mimed a small circle with her hands. She pointed to the door, then to the street, her gestures sharp and urgent. Drake frowned, trying to interpret. "Y'all think they left something like a tracker?" Her patterns flared briefly in response to her face tightening. Drake cursed under his breath, pulling her away from the window. "All right, we leave now, no waiting." They moved quickly, stepping into the hallway and descending the narrow staircase that led to the building's rear exit. The rain from earlier had stopped, leaving the city streets damp and glistening under the faint glow of neon signs. Drake LED Raver through the alleyways, sticking to the shadows, his senses on high alert. Every distant sound, a muffled conversation, the clatter of a trash can set his nerves on edge. Raver followed closely, her movements soundless, her eyes scanning every corner. The glow of her patterns had dimmed further, as if she were consciously suppressing it. Drake glanced back at her, noting the tension in her posture. She didn't just look cautious, she looked prepared. As if expecting an attack at any moment, they reached the edge of the district where the buildings gave way to a labyrinth of abandoned industrial lots, rusted fences, and crumbling warehouses loomed around them, their silence more oppressive than the bustling streets they had left behind. Drake motioned for Raver to stop crouching near an old storage container to catch his breath. "We're clear for now," he said, though he didn't entirely believe it. Raver knelt beside him, her gaze fixed on the path. Ahead she touched his arm lightly, then pointed to the sky. Drake followed her gesture, his eyes narrowing at first. He saw nothing but the faint glow of the city's light pollution, then a shadow moved, all fast and silent as that his voice trailed off. As the shadow circled again, its movement deliberate. It was too low for a bird, too agile for a drone. "They're watching us," hissed his voice. Barely above a whisper, Reva's hand tightened on his arm, and she gestured for him to move. Her urgency was clear. Drake stood gripping the wrench tightly, and they began to run. The shadow above followed, darting between the sparse clouds. Like a predator circling its prey, they reached the edge of the industrial lot, where a chain-link fence blocked their path. Drake cursed, glancing back as the shadow descended. It was closer now, and he could make out its shape, a sleek metallic device about the size of a large bird. Its surface gleaming faintly, it emitted a low hum like an electro-shirty. Raver stepped forward. Raising her hands, her glowing patterns flared toe-life, brighter than Drake had ever seen them. Tendrils of light extended from her fingertips, wrapping around the device like living vines. The hum grew louder, a sharp piercing sound that made Drake's ears ring. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, the device shattered, its piece falling harmlessly to the ground. Raver staggered, her glow dimming as she clutched her chest. Drake caught her breath as she fell, steadying her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice tight. With concern she nodded weakly, but her expression was strained. Drake glanced at the shattered remains of the device that was a scalp, said, "If they weren't sure where we were before, they are now." He helped Raver through a gap in the fence, and they continued into the night. The mountains she had drawn on the paper were still miles away, but they had no choice but to keep moving. The city was no longer there. Ally, it was a battlefield, and they were outnumbered as they disappeared into the shadows. Drake couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come, but one thing was certain: he wasn't about to let Raver face it alone. The stars above seemed muted, their light struggling to penetrate the haze of the city. Left behind, Drake and Raver trudged through the uneven terrain at the edge of an abandoned highway, their breaths forming misty clouds in the cool night air. The backpack felt heavier with each step, but Drake pressed on, his grip on the straps tightening each time he glanced at Ravash. Walked with determination that the dimming of her glowing patterns told a different story. Whatever energy she had expended destroying the scout drone had taken its toll. Her shoulders slumped, and her steps faltered more often. Drake slowed his pace, letting her catch up without calling attention to it. "You holding up?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Raver nodded, but didn't look at him. Her glowing eyes remained fixed on the path ahead. Her focus on yielding, she gestured toward the jagged silhouette of the mountains in the distance, her meaning clear: "Keep moving." Drake scanned the horizon. The mountains looked impossibly far, their peaks barely visible against the starless sky. He adjusted the straps on his backpack, his mind racing through options. They needed rest, but stopping here so close to the city and their pursuers wasn't an option. Glanced at Raver again, her fragility at odds with the otherworldly power she had displayed earlier. "We'll find somewhere safer," he said, as much to himself as to her. The faint hum of the drone still echoed in his mind, a reminder of how close they had come to being caught. The shattered remains of the machine now lay far behind them, but its message had already been delivered. Whoever was hunting Raver knew their direction, if not their exact location. As they crested a small rise, Drake spotted a structure in the distance. It was a dilapidated rest stop, its roof partially caved in, and its windows shattered. A faint neon sign flickered above the entrance. The words long since faded beyond recognition had pointed toward it. There, it's not much, but it'll give us cover. Raver hesitated. Luminous patterns flickering faintly before nodding together. They approached the building, their footsteps crunching over gravel and broken glass. Drake pushed the door open cautiously, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, Thea was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and rust. Broken chairs and tables littered the floor, and the faint thum of a generator indicated some lingering source of power. Drake scanned the room, his instincts on high alert. He gestured for Raver to stay back as he moved further inside, his eyes sweeping over the shadows, satisfied that they were alone. He waved her in its clear. Raver entered, her glowing patterns casting faint, dancing light across the walls. She moved to a corner and sank to the ground, her exhaustion evident. Drake sat down his backpack and knelt beside her. You need to rest, he said. We'll keep watching shifts. She shook her head, her glowing eyes narrowing as she pointed toward the shattered windows and mind scanning Theria. She didn't trust the safety of this place, and neither did he, but there was no other option. Drake reached into his backpack and pulled out a water bottle, handing it to her. Drink, you used a lot of energy back there. Reva took the bottle, her fingers brushing against his. Briefly she hesitated before taking a sip, her expression softening as she handed it back. Her glow brightened slightly, a sign that she was regaining some strength. Drake leaned against Thule, staring out the window. We need a plan, he muttered, more to himself than her. We can't just keep running, there has to be a way to stop them. Reva shifted, her patterns pulsing. In response, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small crystalline shard. Its surface shimmered faintly, reflecting her glow like a prism. She held it out to him, her eyes expectant. What is this? Drake asked, taking the shard carefully. It was cool to the touch, its weight negligible, but its presence almost overwhelming. He felt a faint hum, as though the shard itself were alive. Reva placed a hand on her chest, then gestured to the shard, miming a transfer of energy. She pointed to the mountains, her expression urgent. Drake frowned. This is part of the sphere, isn't it? You said you were carrying its essence. This is what they're after. Reva nodded, her patterns flaring briefly before dimming again. She minded the shard being joined with something larger, her gestures deliberate and precise. They need the whole thing, Drake said, understanding dawning. And if we get you to wherever you're pointing at in the mountains, it'll be safe or whole again. Raven nodded again, her gaze steady. She tapped her chest and pointed to him, then to the shard. Drake sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, we keep moving at first light. We'll find this place you're talking about before Itheroth them could speak further. A sharp metallic clink echoed from outside. Drake froze, his instincts screaming. Reva's patterns flared in alarm, her body tensing as she pointed toward the window. A shadow moved in the darkness, followed another. Drake's grip tightened on the wrench still tucked into his belt. They're here, he whispered. Reva moved toward him, her hand brushing his arm. As her glow dimmed in near invisibility, she crouched low, her gaze locked on the window. Drake followed suit, his mind racing. They had no way out, but the front door and the hunters were closing in. The faint hum of machinery grew louder, and a beam of light swept across the building. Reva patterns licked and she clutched the shard tightly, her expression resolute. Drake motioned for her to stay behind him as he edged closer to the window, peering out cautiously. Two figures stood just beyond the broken fence, their forms shrouded in black cloaks similar to the one the earlier hunter had worn. They moved with an eerie synchronicity, their weapons glowing faintly in the dark. Drake's mind raced. He turned to Reva, his voice a low whisper. Can you do what you did to the drone, take out their weapons? She shook her head, her patterns flickering weakly. Whatever energy she had left wasn't enough for another display of power. Drake cursed under his breath, gripping the wrench tightly. Then we fight. Reva at his arm, her gaze intense. She held up The shard then gestured toward the mountains, her meaning clear. He had to get it there. No matter what, Drake hesitated, his chest tightening. At the implication, "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice firm. She shook her head, her expression softening, but resolute. She touched his chest, then the shard, before miming running her patterns. Dimmed further, but her determination burned brightly in her gaze. The hunters moved closer, their steps deliberate and synchronized. Drake's jaw tightened as he made his decision. He turned back to Ravaith. "You think I'm abandoning you? You don't know me very well." He stood wrench in hand as the first hunter stepped through the door. The faint glow of dawn cast the mountains and soft hues of gray and blue, their jagged peaks slicing into the sky like ancient sentinels. Drake staggered, his injured side screaming with each step, but the sight of their destination steeled his resolve. Beside him, Rava moved with renewed purpose, her glowing patterns pulsing in steady waves. The shard in her hands emitted a faint rhythmic hum, resonating with the peaks ahead. It was as if the mountains themselves were calling them. "We're close," Drake said, his voice a rasp. He adjusted straps of his backpack, his body begging for rest. Rava turned to him, her luminous eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before, determination and gratitude. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, and nodded. They pressed in the air, growing thinner as the trail steepened. The ground beneath their feet shifted from loose dirt to jagged stone, and the remnants of a long-abandoned path guided them upward. The shard's hum grew louder, its vibrations syncing with the faint tremors. Drake could now feel in the ground. Something awaited them ahead. Something powerful. The path narrowed as they reached a plateau, revealing a massive stone structure nestled against the mountain's face. It was unlike anything Drake had seen before, a fusion of natural rock and otherworldly design. Smooth, glowing lines etched into the stone pulsed with the same rhythm as the shard, creating an almost musical resonance. The air vibrated with energy, alive. An ancient Rava stopped, her gaze fixed on the structure. She clutched the shard tightly, her pattern flaring to match the glowing lines of the stone. She turned to Drake, her expression a mixture of anticipation and fear. She gestured toward the structure, then placed a hand on her chest, miming a deep inhale. "This is it," Drake said, his voice hushed. "Whatever this place is what you've been looking for." Rava nodded and stepped forward, the shard's hum intensifying with each movement as they approached the entrance, a massive arched doorway carved directly into the mountain. The glowing lines brightened, illuminating the path ahead. The shard in Rava's hands responded, its glow now almost blinding. She hesitated at the threshold, turning to look at Drake. "You're not going in alone," he said firmly, stepping beside her. "Let him finish this together." She smiled faintly, her glowing patterns softening as she nodded. Together they stepped into the structure. Interior was vast, a cavernous space filled with towering columns that seemed to grow from the mountain itself. The air buzzed with an almost imperceptible hum, the sound of energy coursing through the walls. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface smooth and reflective. Above it hovered a faint translucent image of the sphere, holy and radiant. The shard in Rava's hands pulsed in sync with the image. As if drawn to it, Rava moved toward the pedestal, her steps deliberate. Drake followed, his gaze darting around the chamber. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The hunters had proven relentless, and he doubted they would let them finish this without interference. "Rava," he said, his voice low, "whatever you're about to do, make it quick. I don't trust this quiet." She nodded, her focus entirely on the pedestal. As she approached, the shard began to lift from her hands, floating gently toward the image of the sphere. The room's hum grew louder, the glowing lines along the walls flaring with intensity. Rava reached out, her glowing patterns merging with the shard's light. Connection was instantaneous. The shard fused with the sphere's image, creating a pulse of energy that rippled through the chamber. Rava staggered, but Drake caught her before she fell. The sphere glowed brighter, its light filling the room with a warmth that was both overwhelming and comforting. Then the sound of footsteps heard from the entrance. Drake turned, his body tensing. The hunters had found them. 3 figures stepped into the chamber, their cloaked forms silhouetted against the glowing lines of the walls there. Weapons thrummed with deadly energy, their movements precise and synchronized. Rava straightened, her glow intensifying as she stepped in front of Drake. She raised her hands, the lines on her skin flaring with a brilliance that forced the hunters to pause. The sphere above the pedestal pulsed in response, light radiating outward. Like a protective barrier, the lead hunter raised its weapon, its mask tilting slightly, as it assessed the situation before it could act. Rava spoke, her voice was clear and melodic, her alien language carrying an undeniable authority. The hunters hesitated, their movements stuttering as if caught in an internal conflict. "What are you saying?" Drake asked, his voice a whisper. Rava turned to him briefly, her expression resolute. She touched her chest, then gestured toward the sphere, her meaning clear. She was offering herself. "No," Drake said, stepping forward, "you don't have to do this. There has to be another way." Rava shook her head, her gaze soft but unyielding. She reached out her hand, brushing his cheek briefly, before turning back to the hunters. She raised her hands again, her glow intensifying to the point where it eclipsed the sphere's light. The hunters faltered, their weapons lowering as if compelled by her command. The sphere pulsed once more, sending out a shock wave that knocked the hunters off their feet. Glowing lines along the walls began to converge, channeling their energy into the sphere. Rava stepped forward, her patterns now fully synchronized with the sphere's light. She turned to Drake one last time, her eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. "Rava, don't," Drake shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the crescendo of energy filling the chamber. Rava placed her hands on the sphere, and the light exploded outward, enveloping the room in a blinding glow. Drake shielded his eyes, the force of the energy knocking him to the ground. When the light finally subsided, the chamber was silent. Rava was gone. The pedestal now stood empty, the sphere's image having disappeared. The glowing lines along the walls had dimmed there. Energy spent, the hunters lay motionless, their forms crumpled and lifeless. Drake staggered to his feet, his chest tight as he scanned the room. "Rava," he called, his voice echoing through the cavern. There was no response or say. The shard, now whole, floated gently back to the pedestal. Its glow was faint, but steady, a quiet reminder of what had been sacrificed. Drake approached it slowly, his hand trembling as he reached out. The shard pulsed once, and an image filled his mind. A vision of Rava smiling, her patterns glowing with a soft, serene light. She was free. Drake lowered his hand, his jaw tightening. He turned toward the entrance, the weight of what had happened settling heavily on his shoulders. The hunters were gone. The shard was safe, and the threat had passed, but the cost was more than he had ever imagined. As he stepped out into the morning light, the mountains bathed in the warm glow of the rising sun, he felt a strange sense of peace. Rava had completed her mission, and though she was gone, her sacrifice had saved more than just him. She had saved worlds. Drake adjusted his backpack and began the long trek down the mountain. The shard's faint hum followed him, a quiet promise that her light would never fade.